I'm very excited about opening the 18th edition of this incredible conference. I would especially like to thank our partner for this evening, the Brussels Privacy Hub, for co-organizing this evening with a very unique and special discussion coming up. And also an evening finishing with a cocktail to meet old and new friends from the community. And although CPDP is of course famous for its work in law and legislation, we have always done tremendous efforts to break down existing borders between other fields. For example, with computer science, sociology, health. But we are also, I think I may say, famous for our collaborations with artists. And not only do we have the CPDP Culture Club as part of our program, it is a program with artist talks and keynotes and screenings. It's in the cinema on the 3rd floor of this building. We also run a live radio together with DubLab. They are at the back of this floor. During the conference, you will be able to participate live in their radio program with DJs and with panel discussions with generally young professionals and students who don't yet get a place on this stage. But voilà, they are the next generation, and a spoiler alert, they do have interesting visions also. Annually, CPDP searches for a collaboration with an artist to create an artwork relating to the topic discussed or the topics discussed at this conference. And in the past, we worked with famous artists like Vladan Jolder and David Shrigley, Adam Harvey. And this year, we have the honor of inviting James Bridle for this collaboration. It's in front of this desk. It's also on the conference bags. You will see the artwork all over CPDP. And we are lucky that James has taken the time to connect with us tonight, so I can ask him a couple of questions concerning what he did for us. So James Bridle is an artist and a technologist and a writer, and many people from the CPDP community have read his New Dark Age from 2018 and Ways of Being, a more recent book of 2022. By the way, these books are for sale at our bookshop. Small commercial here. And the work of this artist, James Bridle, has also been exhibited worldwide. So I don't know if it's possible to get James on the screen. It's a bit bright here.
Good evening, can you hear me?
We do hear you. Good evening.
Okay. There's just been a power cut, which is why I'm coming to you in this slightly atmospheric form.
Okay.
Happened about 30 seconds ago, so there's not a lot I can do about it, I'm afraid.
No. Wow. Okay. Well, power cuts. It's already an interesting happening. Let's say what to do without power, right? And
I can tell you in this case that this power cut has specifically been caused by a wildfire. I live on a small Greek island, and we get our power from the next island over, and there's a wildfire burning over there. That's what's happening right now, and that's why the power's gone off.
okay, so
So this is Zoom calls and everything else in the age of climate change and much else.
excellent. Voilà. Okay, but it still works. It works. So let's get to it. Let's talk about your work. So the theme of CPDP.ai is "The World is Watching." And months ago, I approached you, and in the process of working together. From one idea, you radically changed to another, which turned out very, very well. I mean, both ideas would have been very appreciated by me and by the audience too, I think. And can you say something about your original proposal and tell us how your connection with the title now, "The World is Watching," has influenced to the final outcome of what you did?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really resonant title for me. I remember first, I think, hearing the phrase, which I think now is familiar to many of us, but I remember it really, I don't know exactly where it came from, but I first came across it around the Occupy protests, in which was what, sort of 2012, 2013. I was living in New York at the time, I was working there, and it was the time of Occupy Wall Street. And that phrase was often used and was chanted by people in the street, specifically while they were sort of holding up phones to live stream events that were occurring, usually attempts by the police to clear the encampment there. And it felt like a really extraordinary gesture, like both a physical gesture, this pose that people held with their arms up in the air that I found to be really striking, and also this sudden thing, this mass live streaming event. Oh, power's back. This mass live streaming events, which was so indicative of those protests that kind of enabled really a new form of protest, a protest that took place in specific physical space, while also being accessible worldwide. And, you know, we saw that through all kinds of protests through the last decade, from Occupy Wall Street to the Arab Spring protests, the protests of the squares, this kind of mediatic event that was enabled by this sort of world is watching gesture. So I think it's a very powerful title and something that's that continues to be important, though I struggle a lot, as I think we talked about, with its efficacy. Because let's be honest, the world may be watching, but the world is rarely actually doing anything. The Occupy protests recede into memory while the 1% takes power. The Arab Springs didn't turn out very well in most places, and we can see with what's happening in Gaza and elsewhere right now that things can be live streamed as much as we like, but it doesn't necessarily produce political change. And part of that disillusionment for me has been manifests in looking a little broader, looking a little more widely for solidarity for us as humans, really in the world. And so my work over the last 10 years has traveled from being a focus on technology and specifically tech and media criticism, kind of investigating forms of media and technology to understand more about them, to a broader focus on ecology that started with a look at how technology and ecology interacted, looking at things like the carbon emissions of data centers, the kind of cost of computing, through things like extraction, like what these machines are made of, where that stuff comes from, through to lithium extraction for batteries, starting to understand that when we talk about technology, we are always talking about something that is rooted deeply in the world. Like me, many of you probably sort of grew up on the internet, and the internet and everything associated with it really therefore feels like a different world, a separate world. But it's not. It all comes from the earth. And so in recent years, I've been spending more of my time thinking about ecological relations and the kind of beinghood of other creatures in this world. As Thierry mentioned, that my more recent book, Ways of Being, is about thinking about technology, but ecologically, and understanding how it ties us to the world in deep, deep ways. And so I sort of realized that rethinking this phrase, the world is watching, really made me think about, well, who do we mean when we speak about the world? You know, do we just mean other humans, or do we think about all the other beings that we share the planet with, who are also bound up in our fate? You know, who are, you know, in large part suffering from the things that we're doing, but also have much to teach us about what we're doing, both about what we might make and how we might all thrive together. So this brief sort of, for me, widened out into some form of representation of all those other beings that are also watching along with us, which includes humans, the eyes in front of Thierry on the stage there. It includes all kinds of other species. It also includes machines. There are little drones and various AI eyes and various things like that in there as well. Because all of these things, all of these beings of various kinds are looking at the world, are watching us, we're watching back. We're all caught up together, trying to understand the world around us and trying to perhaps do something about it.
Yes, thank you. And I really appreciate the very naive approach of the drawings. And during the process, you also showed me the sketches and how you made lists of certain kind of eyes that were interesting to you, and voilà. We had the joy to play around with your eyes, which we could do. So we happily did that in all our communication. You haven't seen it yet, James, but I'll send you a package. And I wanted to proceed this year. We developed focused tracks at CPDP, and one track, for example, on Thursday is focusing on DPOs and a new job that came together with GDPR. Another track tomorrow is the computer science track, and this track is another example of how we try to build bridges with other fields. And your work is actually an example of how this bridging can be very functional. I think, well, you think about computer science in a very philosophical way, but at the same time, you really want to understand the functionality of a computer or of a chip or a program or an algorithm. And I personally compare that with classical painting, where painters needed to learn about the chemistry of their products, for example. And could you explain how this works for you? How far do you go in learning about the inside of technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely critical for me. I studied computer science myself. My master's was in computer science and cognitive science a long time ago, in the kind of the cognitive science part in the last the beginning of the last AI winter, let's say, when it was all falling apart the last time. You know, I really enjoyed computer science at the time in very unexpected ways. I got into it because I was interested in the internet, and I didn't know much about logic and mathematics and so on and so forth, which turns out to be quite an important part of it. But what I really enjoyed was this experience of going really, really deep into systems and learning how to understand things at the systemic level, understand how things connect, and understanding how to intervene in systems at really critical junctures. That's not necessarily what computer science explicitly teaches you. Most people learn it in order to, you know, do computer science kind of as an occupation, as programming and so on and so forth. But it is actually a fantastic education in a kind of systems thinking if you want to take it that way. I think it gives people the ability to kind of parse systems, to see how things interconnect, and therefore to have access to them. And I've realized over time that in whatever field that I'm in, whether that's making art, whether it's architecture, I'm currently building a house, and I find myself taking this systems approach through to every aspect of a very physical activity like that. And so, yeah, I've always treasured this ability to be able to take systems apart and therefore to really understand something about them. It's my fairly fundamental belief that it's one of the central problems of the world today, is that most of us are on some level, not always consciously, but consciously or unconsciously, aware that we live within incredibly complex systems about which we know really very little. I think most people in the room, this room, have a good understanding of aspects of how computers work. Most people don't. And most people also don't know how the financial system works, or the intricacies of how democracy works, of how corporate structures work. Like the really large systems that affect our lives on a very daily basis and absolutely shape them are inscrutable to most of us. And most of us are aware of that on some level, and it's deeply disturbing. I believe it's something that really strikes at the heart of the possibilities for kind of social cohesion and happiness, essentially. Because when you're constantly being traumatized by the awareness that you don't understand the world around you, the result of that is usually some kind of form of fear, which shades into kind of anger, distrust, all the symptoms, the large macro scale symptoms we see in society and our democracies and globally at present. So for me, there's a direct relationship between the transparency or otherwise of complex systems that dominate everyday lives and our ability to function meaningfully and with justice within those systems. And when we live all the time amongst deeply opaque systems over which we have no control and little understanding, we're not really able to function well as democratic citizens, or frankly, as like living, constantly joyful humans, which we should. So in my work, my response is often to delve very deep into systems and try to build them myself. That's really where the artistic part of it, such as it is, comes in, is because, as you said, the hoariest, oldest line about art is that great artists mix their own paint. Great artist or not, if you don't have an understanding of the material that you're working with, you can't produce the most interesting results from it. That's all that phrase means. And so if one wants as an artist to make work about computers, the internet, about a specific technology like artificial intelligence or machine learning, then one needs a deep understanding of them. So in my work, I do things like build machine learning systems, not terribly well, but well enough to work. A few years ago, I set out to build my own self-driving car, or at least to train a self-driving car to recognize its surroundings and give instructions. Because I felt that if I didn't have a deep understanding of how that system functioned, I would have no understanding of the possibilities of it. And I think so many of us work at these different levels in which the technology that we have to work with is a given, right? Like, this is the software you will use, and therefore you have very little control over it. That happens in computer science, it happens in architecture, it happens in design, it happens in offices when you have to use Microsoft Suite software. You're given something that determines most of your actions. And so what I'm interested in is, like, what are the real deeper possibilities of the technologies that we are sometimes given and that we're sometimes capable of writing ourselves, because they're powerful. They run right down there in the metal and we can change the world with them if we fully understand their capabilities.
Right, thank you, James. Time is not on our side. We don't have much time, I'm afraid. And although I would love to talk for hours with you, or it's also a pity that you're not here. But I'm gonna have to close this conversation. I'm very grateful for the collaboration. Voilà, I'm also looking forward to the reactions from the audience on what you did, voilà. Good luck in Greece and with the the blackouts. I hope
Thank you.
there's not too many of them, but voilà. I know you'll manage also without power, right?
We'll build something.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
James.
you very much. Thank you. Have a wonderful conference.
Yeah. So I would like to give the floor to Mireille.
And I would like to have the PowerPoint. Ah, there it is. Because without the PowerPoint, I have no idea what I'm going to say. It's actually true. Of course, I could talk for hours, but... so I want to talk about geopolitics, geoeconomics, and AI in relation to data protection. Technology. This is a good technology. It goes only in one direction. It's like the arrow of time, right? So in 2009, during the first ever CPDP conference, if I'm correct, sometimes my sense of time is not as good as it used to be, we organized the first ever philosophers seminar at CPDP, which we then did 5 more times, I think. And that first time I co-organized that with Antoinette Rouvroy. And this was a very exciting beginning. The format of that philosophers seminar was slow thinking, listening, listening, listening. The theme that we chose, apart from law and human agency, was autonomic computing. That was a term that was coined at the time by IBM, a term that nobody uses anymore, but I think it's a very interesting term. So basically IBM said, we have an autonomic nervous system. It decides for us whether our heartbeat has to go up because you're giving a keynote, whether you have to breathe more, whether you get a dry mouth. It's not that that nervous system is going to ask us about this, our advice or our consent. And we probably wouldn't want that. And they said something similar is going to happen with our societal infrastructure, basically meaning that this societal infrastructure, and I will explain to you what I mean with that, is going to be run on subliminal machines that settle and change and adapt our environment in a way that anticipates us. So you could say that they were already talking about the creation of a computational subconscious. Now, of course, that means that these systems largely run on behavioral data. Examples is energy usage data. So when you put on the light, maybe you didn't know that, but you are creating, if you have a smart meter, energy usage data. This is data about human behavior. When we talk about large language models, we're talking about language usage data. And it's very good to remember that that also is about behavioral data. Well, then we have mobility data, purchasing data, financial transaction data, social media data. Behavior there, for instance, is like behavior. Why is this important and why is this interesting? Well, because behavioral data is always historical data, for the simple reason that you cannot train a model on future data. And though that sounds completely obvious, it's very important, because basically it means that these systems can only scale the past, and to the extent that we're going to depend on them, to some extent freeze the future. So the usual talk that law runs behind and that computer science is running ahead is totally incorrect. The use of language is about imagination, is about moving forward, looking from different perspectives, but that is not something that computing systems can do. Of course, in 2009, this was still about ideas from IBM. At this moment, it's a reality. Many of our systems at this moment are run on this type of data, and in Europe, we are firmly dedicated to what is called the digital transition. Now, I want to do 5 things. First, I'm going to make a distinction between artificial general intelligence, which of course doesn't exist, or does it? But the fact that something doesn't exist doesn't mean that it has not got an impact. And I want to distinguish that from AI as a normal technology. I want to draw from that very briefly some geopolitical and geoeconomic impacts. And that, of course, is related to the so-called Brussels effect of the legislation and policy we prepare here. I want to very briefly say something about the EU continent, sorry, I misspelled that, the AI continent action plan that has just come out from the EU. And then draw some conclusions for privacy, contextual integrity, and purpose limitation. So let's start about the race for artificial general intelligence that is going on. And I'm going to use for that an article that was written, I think already 2 years ago, by Gebru and Torres. Gebru was one of the authors of the article about stochastic parrots, for which she was resigned by Google, which means that the concept or the verb resigned suddenly became a transitive verb, which it was not before that. So again, I think this article is very interesting and in some sense prophetic. So let's first see how artificial general intelligence is defined. So they sum up a lot of different definitions. I'm picking out 2. One by OpenAI, you can find it on their website. They say AGI is a highly autonomous system that outperforms humans at most economically valuable work. So first we see this is supposed to be about outperforming humans. So it's not AI is doing things that only humans could do. No, it's outperforming. This is a different thing. And then they're a non-profit, right? There's a lot of fuss about this. But they're interested in what is economically valuable. What is economically valuable is that when I do shopping or change diapers or take care of my grandparents, well, they're not alive anymore, sorry. Or is that about a job for which you get paid, or is it investing in something? Let's take another definition by Russell and Norvig, who wrote a famous handbook, so they are scientists, on artificial intelligence, the modern approach. They have a totally different definition, which says it is a universal algorithm for learning and acting in any environment. So here, it's not about practical applications, it's about building models and systems. It's a very different thing. I thought that David Wolper had proven mathematically that this aim is not possible, that you cannot develop an algorithm that will function successfully in different contexts. I think it'd be very interesting to see how he looks at this definition. Now, what I want to do is to look with Gabriel and Torres at the ideologies that drive the race to attempt to build AGI. And they use the acronym TESCREOL for that, which stands for transhumanism, extropianism, Singularitarianism, I practice that one. Cosmism, rationalism, and long-terminism. And what comes before that you will see on the next slide. Sorry, I forgot. Ethical altruism. Altruism, yes. Very good. So, transhumanism. Let's first look at the fact that they say that all these ideologies derive from eugenetics, 19th century eugenetics, Galton. Galton said, now, if all people who are, according to us or to whoever, stupid, or in another sense, inferior, if we make sure that they do not procreate, and if all the people that are good procreate, then we get a better human race. 19th century, first wave eugenics. And in the end, eugenics is about creating a post-human species. And you see in all these ideologies this idea of building a better human race. Radical human enhancement is not about who can procreate and who cannot procreate, but it's about using drugs and human implants to make better humans. And they call that radical human enhancement. It's not that somebody is disabled and is brought back to a human level. No, it's that all of us or a selection are going to be better. Extropianism. That's very interesting. So extropy is used here as the opposite of entropy, though entropy, as you all know, perhaps is connected with the second law of thermodynamics, but they are using it completely metaphorically here. It has nothing to do with the science. So they're saying they want to move beyond current human boundaries, and what they want to do is upload minds, and in that way and in other ways achieve immortality. For instance, by freezing people before they die, cryonics, and then waking them up. And I already see people laughing because we think maybe that's nonsense or it's not a good idea or it's never going to happen. The point of this article and of Gebru and Torres is that people with very, very deep pockets are investing in this. And the point is that whether it's possible or not is not really the point. This investment has enormous transformative effects on sustainability, on privacy, to give one example. The next one is singularitarianism. So this is the merging of human and machines. And the further idea of, if you can do that, you can make lots of AI entities or singularitarian entities. And you can send them out into the universe. And that means there are going to be a lot of separate entities. And I will come back to that when discussing long-terminism. So the idea is to infuse the universe with a new type of consciousness and superintelligence. Cosmism is another ideology, but it sounds a bit, all these ideologies are partly overlapping, similar. It's about sentient AI, again, mind uploading, again, immortality, and about transforming the universe. So remember, this is about going into outer space and peopling outer space with these entities. Rationalism, effective altruism, that was the term, and long-terminism, they sort of belong together. They're about how to make the world better. As a lawyer, of course, the first question is who gets to determine what is better? And then to say, okay, if you want to make the world better, do that in a logical, in a rational way. So do it with AI. Many of the people who invest in these ideologies and believe in them are not computer scientists. They don't know that much about the underlying technologies. But once again, that doesn't mean they don't have an impact. Long-terminism is a specific brand of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism assumes that you can do ethics by calculation. And the interesting idea when you look at the overlap here is to say that if you have all these intelligent entities all over the universe and you want to maximize value and you're going to count the utility or the happiness of each of these new agents, then people who live now can be sacrificed because there are only a few people compared to all these entities that are going to be terribly happy and valuable. So basically they're saying that these different strands, and I've not called any names, but it is very interesting to actually take note of the article and to see who are the names behind this. Where are the deep pockets? Where are they investing in? So if you, oh sorry, that's the wrong button. So if you have heard all this, there is a, what they call, with a biblical term, there are eschatological overtones here. So eschatology is the biblical term for striving for the end of times in a way that is absolutely fantastic and better than anything we had. So many of the people who are investing in this talk about paradise engineering. And what they want to engineer is the global ecosystem, but also the universe, that's clear. If you want to create an ideal society, then you're also going to run into the apocalyptic biblical term. So if you're doing eschatology, of course, you will also be warning against apocalypse. So you're not so much worried about the fact that maybe this is discriminatory here and now, harming people here and now. No, you're going to keep your eye on the ball in the far future. And this is often defined as if the values of artificial general intelligence are not aligned, we may be in for doom. And of course, the question here for a lawyer, again, is aligned with whose values and who gets to decide these values, who gets to define them. And as I said, Gebru and Torres point out that basically this whole project of these different ideologies have strong discriminatory assumptions, basically racist. A lot of white supremacists are part of the people who are funding these investments. And ableist, so the idea that somebody who has some whatever disability, basically in the long term, that kind of people should not exist. So there are certain assumptions here. And we should not be mistaken the fact that it doesn't work or doesn't exist or that it's not a good idea or that we're all against it is not going to save us from people who are investing in this. Now, one of the important points Gabriel and Torres make is that systems that are built with the goal of performing any task under any circumstance are fundamentally unsafe because they do not align with fundamental engineering principles. If you want to build a safe system, you have to be able to test that system, and if you want to test the system, it has to be well scoped and constrained. Otherwise, if you don't know what exactly the system is supposed to do, you cannot test whether it actually does this. This is what I said before. The fact that we may think here that this is never going to work is not going to save us from the implications. There's a famous philosopher of science, Thomas Merton, who said, if men or women define a situation as real, it is real in its consequences. And that is basically what is happening here. And a further consequence of that I've been highlighting for a long time is a variation of this axiom. If machines define a situation as real, at some point it may be real in its consequences. And we have to pay keen attention to that. Here we have another article written by computer scientists, a very technical mathematical article about why AGI, the claims that are made on behalf of AGI, are unproven and unscientific. Basically, these claims say that these systems can understand reality, causality, etc., and that is based on the fact that in technically what is called latent space, so a space that is not related to data on which they were trained, that they can give correct predictions about what happens in that latent space. And people conclude from that that these systems actually understand, so that they're moving towards human understanding and sentience. And they basically explain from a computer science perspective why that is absolutely rushing to things. I want to use two other scientists, Narayanan and Kapoor at Princeton University, who have written the book AI Snake Oil, which I would advise anybody to read. They are now working on a new book under the working title, AI as Normal Technology. Basically, they are, like Torres and Gebru, they are saying that AGI research should be rejected because the concept is incoherent. So they're saying we have to look at AI, not AGI, but AI as a normal technology. But they say the fact that it's a normal technology does not mean that it's not transformative. And they're saying what we need to do as scientists here is to describe, to predict, and to prescribe AI so that we get the sort of AI that is safe in the sense of health, safety in the harm sense, but also in terms of fundamental rights. They also highlight the relationship between society and technology, reject technological determinism, highlight the need for human control. And here, let's look at a table that's always interesting. So basically, they are saying that the development of these models and systems, because that development is computational, can go very fast. But to turn those models and systems into products and services is a totally different matter. That takes a lot of time. You need domain expertise. Then the next question is, are people going to take up these products and services? And to understand that, you need to know something about how social reality works. That, again, is a different domain of knowledge, which, and of course, a different reality. We are then talking about the real world. So there is a difference between performance metrics, like accuracy, which work in the closed system of the model, and real-world reliability. The two may be totally apart, so you may have accuracy of 95% and the system may be totally unreliable in the real world, and that's what they basically point out. So they make a difference between methods, applications, and adoption, point out the different timescales, and they highlight the relationship between AI methodology, which is computational, and human domain knowledge that you need when you want people to adopt things in the real world. So this is where we are now with our AGI. The UN Environmental Programme has sketched some implications of the uptake and the development of AI. They note that there will have to be a lot of data servers, cloud infrastructure, as we used to call it, water and electricity, and of course critical minerals and rare elements for the batteries. Now, all that generates a new type of geopolitical competition. So many people are worried about fossil fuels, and we kind of know where they are, but the struggles at this moment, geopolitically and geoeconomically, and they have an enormous impact on geopolitics, is where are these critical minerals? there, for instance, in Greenland, as you can understand. So they're in all sorts of places that we have maybe never heard of, but the struggle is going on now. So all these people that are looking at fossil fuels for very good reasons, they should look now at the sort of exploitation that is, and the competition between China, the United States, Europe, etc., on where these critical minerals are, because sometimes they're in countries that cannot defend themselves against this competition. So if you want to do something about fossil fuels, look here. This is where the new struggles are taking place. Of course, also we suddenly see private companies investing in renewables, which sounds great, but they get bored with that because it takes time, and they're now moving into nuclear energy. So they want to invest, they have money enough in building nuclear energy, not depending on taxpayers' money. Again, something to watch for. So you could say generative AI generates and exacerbates climate change, but also, and interestingly, geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. Now, we could say, well, we have here in Europe, we have a very strong legislature. And for instance, the GDPR, as Anu Bradford has said, that, no, the back, yes, I found the back button. There is a Brussels effect, so we should not worry. As long as our legislation is taking care of things, we will be exporting our approach to other countries. The Brussels effect actually connects with two different types of effects which had been seen in the United States. First of all, Delaware effect. Delaware had very low taxes on corporations. So many corporations incorporated in Delaware. So other states said, we don't want that, we want them here. So they also lowered their taxes. And as you can imagine, this is what we call a race to the bottom. But there was also something called the California effect. California has a very strong consumer market. Everybody wants to, all corporations want to compete on that market, and California had very stringent consumer and environmental law. Most corporations don't want to adapt their business model to 51 states. We're talking about the United States. So they thought if we stick to the level of protection, the requirements that California has, then we will probably be compliant in all the other states. And that meant that by putting a very high threshold, California basically determined what happened in the rest of the United States. Now, this is where the Brussels effect comes from. Basically, the idea is that in the rest of the world, people are going to build, provide, disseminate EU-compliant AI applications because of this high level of protection in the EU, and because they don't want to change their internal business processes. We're talking about multinational corporations. Well, doesn't that sound fantastic? But there were 5 or 4, we shall soon see how many, conditions on which this depends. The first is that corporations want to actually compete on the EU market. So the EU must have a strong internal market, interesting for corporations to compete on. The second is that the EU must indeed have the most stringent data protection law, otherwise they will turn to the more stringent data protection law. If you look at China, I think you can't be sure that it's going to be the EU. It might be China, though they're still building up. They have a lot of regulation that is not legally binding, but they have a date when they will have the legally binding system in place, and that's going to be more strict and maybe also different from our type of legislation. If that is the case, then corporations might say, let's take China, then we'll probably also comply in Europe. The third condition is once a corporation complies with the most, oh yes, that's what I just talked about. The fourth is, that's a very economic term, inelasticity of the regulated targets. So the regulated targets are AI systems. If the fact that complying with legislation is going to have a cost, because you have to change your business processes, and if the functionality of these systems may go down, that's of course not necessarily the case, but it might be. So there are then two different types of costs. If corporations don't mind that, then the Brussels effect might take place. If corporations say no, that costs are too high, we're going to differentiate, we'll take care of this compliant in Europe but not somewhere else, that depends on the costs. That's also another condition. And then, of course, the non-divisibility of the global market for these things. In an era of protectionism, where many people expect that there will be three realms of economic influence, economic and political influence. So the United States will take what is south and north of itself and say, that's my realm, I determine everything and I don't need anything from anybody else. We leave Asia to China and Europe can figure it out with Russia. If that happens, then the fifth condition may also not apply. So the Brussels effect, everything is moving. We're standing on a shifting ground. Now let's have a quick look at the AI Continent Action Plan. So this is, in short, there are 5 strategies. Now I have to look at my own slides because they're far off. I think this is going to be easier. Yeah, so computing infrastructure, that's about creating AI factories and AI gigafactories. It's about supercomputers. That sounds a bit like me. That sounds a bit like there is this belief in AGI. We need supercomputers, we need a lot of computing power because we want AGI, and that means computing a lot of data. So I would warn against that. We don't know yet whether even more data is going to bring better systems. And of course, the consequences in terms of sustainability, it is not sustainable. Okay, then data. European data spaces, we need high quality data for that. Now, what is high quality data? First of all, like I said in the beginning, all behavioral data, and actually any data, is always historical data. So that's the first point. High quality data is always lagging behind. But this data has to be made interoperable. The whole idea of the European data spaces is that you have to make this data interoperable. If you make data interoperable, you're going to lose information. So whether making data interoperable is going to give you high quality data, I have many doubts about that. I think it is possible, but it depends on so many conditions being fulfilled that the speed with which this is pushed, I'm not so sure it is going to be happening. The third, AI literacy. Now, this would be great. If it is done well, this would help people to, for instance, make the difference between AGI dreams and artificial intelligence as a constrained, dedicated, testable and contestable tool that people should always be able to interpret and understand sufficiently to base their decisions on. So if we do that well, it might entail a rejection of the dream of AGI. Oh, then it seems to be that the European Commission believes that we must now all adopt algorithms in a rather, that sounds very problematic to me. I think before you adopt a new technology, you must always ask 3 questions. First, what problem will this technology solve? Social security system, use an algorithmic system for that. What problem does it solve? Well, you'll have speed. You'll have speed. So, efficiency, the problem of efficiency and of slow decision making. The second question is, what problems are not solved. If you are not talking to people, but you are using an algorithm, then the problem of people having a need for social security, having a need for personal attention, is certainly not solved. That problem you cannot solve with an algorithm. So what you often see is technology push. I have an algorithm here, it can solve that problem, so I'm going to sell it to solve that problem. But the problems that we actually have are not solved. The third question is what new problems are created. The sustainability of it all, the fact that if you start running a computing system, that you are always going to have bugs, and that those bugs have to be resolved, and the longer it runs, the more bugs it has. So you create a lot of additional problems. So before deciding to introduce algorithms in the running of our society, always ask these three questions, even before you do a cost-benefit analysis. Because if you've not asked these questions, what is the cost and what is the benefits? You have no idea, actually. And then there is the idea that the regulation has to be simplified, the Draghi report, of course. There the question is I think it's a good idea in general, but the question is what are you going to simplify, how? Okay, so how does this relate to privacy? How does this race for AGI relate to privacy, privacy and data protection, contextual integrity, and purpose limitation? Let's first look at privacy and data protection. And there's going to be repetition. I'm going to draw in what I said before. So AGI runs on behavioral data, largely, that is shared without the awareness of people, because when you push a light button, you're not aware that you're producing energy usage data. From a privacy and data protection perspective, that is problematic. Privacy and data protection have special regimes for what we call in Europe sensitive data. If you're sharing data without awareness, that's not going to work. And we see that in the enthusiasm for AGI, all kinds of privacy and data protection safeguards are sort of thrown out of the window because that's against innovation. And something is happening in Europe, but only after we have all these systems. You could say, let's remove the sensitive data, but then, of course, that will reduce the accuracy and at some point also the reliability of the models that are built. So if you take data protection into account, if you think that's a serious thing, you also have to take into account that there's a cost to the accuracy and the reliability. Yeah, and like I said, if you work with behavioral data, you're working with past data, and that means you are actually by default, especially if you're going to create consolidated data sets that you use for testing and for training, you're always working with past data. So the longer you work with those systems, the less reliable the output will be, because you're basically scaling the past and freezing the future, if you're going to depend on it. AGI thrives on linkability. That's very clear. Privacy and data protection require, by default, unlinkability. Reducing linkability might reduce functionality and make development more expensive. It is also the case that the more data you train on, the more correlations will appear amongst these data. And that also means that more spurious correlations will appear. And it's not at all obvious to detect what is a spurious correlation and what is not. Everybody here knows, of course, what is a spurious correlation. Who knows what is a spurious correlation? Yeah. Uh-oh. Okay, so.
I know what it is. I would not have like a very analytic definition for
So if you have A and B and they are correlated, it might be a confounding factor C, which actually influences both, and A and B have nothing to do with each other. Many spurious correlations in data sets. It's, for a statistician, this is of course the most obvious thing in the world, but in machine learning, if you want to have a good hit with your paper or sell your stuff, it may be better not to discuss spurious correlations. I think there was a long time that statisticians and machine learners hated each other's guts. I think it's going better now. Next to the last slide, this slide and then one and then I stop. So let's look at contextual integrity. Artificial general intelligence obviously thrives on cross-contextual linkability. An algorithm that works in any environment will need access in all these different environments. Cross-contextual linkability requires interoperability. And like I said, if you make data interoperable, you're going to lose information. High performance metrics, so accuracy, precision, recall, fantastic, but that's intra the model. It does not necessarily say anything about real-world reliability. And this is something any computer scientist knows, but that doesn't mean we know it. So this should be primary information in our AI literacy courses with lots of examples. And there are many examples to be given. So AI as a normal technology implies testability. Scientific inquiry then requires contestability. This is about falsifiability. We have Popper. Popper said verification has nothing to do with science. We need falsification. I'm always curious how computer scientists who talk about verification, validation and verification, what they think of Popper. Moving beyond performance metrics towards real-world empirical testing, that is what we need. And with that, I don't mean getting more behavioral data, because that's not empirical testing. Empirical testing will be more costly and take much more time, domain knowledge, etc. But it's extremely important. Finally, purpose limitation, this wonderful principle of the GDPR, of European data protection law. It is close to contextual integrity, but it's more geared to the European jurisdiction, like contextual integrity is more geared to US jurisdiction. With purpose limitation, the key notion is necessity in relation to a purpose. AGI is unscoped and unconstrained, so it cannot be tested. It cannot be validated from a computer science perspective. Note that testing for model accuracy is not testing for real-world reliability. That's added on it. Testing for real-world liability is not a computer science-only testing. Now, if a system or a model is not reliable because it cannot be tested, then it cannot be proven to be effective. And if something is not effective, of course it cannot be necessary. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mireille. We are waiting for the microphones. It was amazing. I invite the panel to come to the stage and please have a seat. I'm speaking from here because here I have microphones now. So maybe just an introduction of this panel, but a retrospective introduction of the keynote of Mireille. We didn't want to introduce it to avoid any bias, but now we can comment. So I'm Gianclaudio Malgieri. I'm associate professor at Leiden University and also co-director of the Brussels Privacy Hub, and I'm very honored to moderate this commenting panel after Mireille Hildebrandt's speech. So just 2 words to say that this is the opening night is always a night of celebration. And today we celebrate the beginning of the 18th edition of CPDP, but also we celebrate the career of Mireille Hildebrandt, and a brilliant scholar who has created essential bridges. She's a bridge maker between disciplines, and at the intersection, she likes a lot interfaces, intersections, and also, I would say, also creating infrastructure on the mainland. So she was named Emerita this year, and after a great career across many different universities, including VUB, where she's Emerita, but also Radboud University, Erasmus at Rotterdam, and many more. So, and it's a nice metaphor, because this is an opening and not a farewell speech. So it's the beginning, even though it's celebrating your Emerita title. Okay, and so to comment on this amazing speech in which we went from anthropological rewiring of humanity, AI as a form of privilege, but also AI Act, geopolitics, we have people that represent the fields in which you have the fields where you have built bridges. So we have tech policy, information science, computer security. The panel doesn't need an introduction, actually, but I will very rapidly say. I'm very honored to have here Helen Nissenbaum, Professor of Information Science at Cornell Tech, Cornelia Kutterer, sorry, I said her that the mistakes in her surname is part of a new identity, and I made the mistake again. So Cornelia has many different affiliations. She has worked for many years in the big tech policy in Brussels, and now she has many more affiliations, University of Grenoble, Considerati, and University of San Francisco, so many things. Bart Jacobs, Professor of Computer Security, Privacy, and Identity at Radboud University. Now maybe we use the microphone. Let's see if it works. Yeah? So maybe I would like to start with Helen. So there was a lot in Mireille's speech about contextual integrity and how the new visions of AI and AGI might be a challenge for purpose limitation, contextual integrity, and so on. Plus, you are an American scholar, and there was a lot of talking about the effect, the Brussels effect, or the elephant in the room, the Trump's effect, and so on. So, Helen, difficult task. I think you can use that.
I feel like going to contextual integrity is just starting too far at the end, if I may. I'm happy to discuss it maybe later on. Because I also, I know that at that part of the talk, Mireille, you were being rushed. And so I didn't follow all the synapses, and I want to ask you some questions. I think maybe I, as a general comment about Mireille's approach to issues, which I want to highlight, is the way, Mireille, you knit together really deep knowledge of what's going on in the computer science domain, in this case AI and AGI, and link that with the geopolitics, which I think is your talk of the Brussels effect, knowing what's going on in California and so on, which many of us, I talk about myself here in the analytic school of thinking, we tend to go directly from characteristics of the technology and then immediately to ethical theory or ethical concepts and analyze those. But in reality, you're not going to be able to predict or prescribe without knowing the realities without using that word too much, without understanding some of the forces that are actually pushing buttons. So I just wanted to comment that, and of course the political economy of all of this is just, I mean, we have traveled this journey and have seen how much the forces of political economy have also directed so much, and many of the values that we would like to see respected are just crushed. So I think you did that kind of elegant job looking at AGI. And I know there's many other comments that I want to make, but maybe I'm going to put this as a question to Mireille, and to come back to at some point. I've avoided AGI. I just think, oh, science fiction, it could be that, it needn't be there. I'm not going to be afraid of it right now. So I want to know whether the current day generative AI that we're witnessing and AI capabilities that are with us at the moment, whether you think that some of what you've observed about AGI also, that story could be told about AI as well.
Quick comment.
Yeah, so I totally agree that AGI, as it is defined and as people are investing in it, doesn't exist. It's an ideology. But my point is, all this money is going there, and it has enormous consequences. And the fact that something is nonsensical, because I think that's what it is, from a computer science perspective, though undoubtedly there are computer scientists who do believe that it's possible. I know them personally also, so I'm not naive. But I think, nevertheless, and this is of course a very naughty thing to say as a lawyer and a philosopher, that from a computer science perspective it's nonsense. So we're all waiting for Bart Jacobs to agree with me. But that's what I think, based on Wolpert, but on many other authors. But I think when the article came out, I thought, oh, conspiracy theory, let it be. But now I think it's all becoming clear how these tech billionaires that are investing in something that is nonsense, but it has enormous implications, if only for the sustainability of the planet and for the geopolitical and economic consequences for the war that is now being waged about these critical minerals, like lithium, I think was already mentioned, but there are others. Is that an answer?
Yes. Well, I was just waiting for you to refer back to the Merton quote about, which I think is just brilliant, and I love your adaptation of it, and I was going to hold back picking that up later on when we come to privacy, because I think it's very relevant.
An important point that was with us during your whole speech was the impact that this ideology has on the industry, or how it drives the industry, and in particular the tech industry. And the policy implications between Europe, US, and you mentioned China, that is not often mentioned. So, Cornelia, you have a privileged position because you have been working for 15 years in the tech policy in Brussels. Big tech, and now you are independent, so you have the freedom to, and also the privilege of having seen this shift, this change. Actually, the change was dramatic in the last few months, but this change in these years. So, what's your view on that?
So, I guess I have actually learned more about it after being outside of big tech and having the ability to dive into, in particular, Silicon Valley and my affiliation there and the connections I have there. I think what Timnut in her article and Mireille described, these are realities. These people are very engaged. When you look at the amount of new organizations that have been created over the last 2-3 years that work on AI policy, it's mind-boggling. And it's actually also something, I mean, almost a little bit jealous. It's so easy today to do this. You just ask ChatGPT or Perplexity or any other tool how to do it, and it's fairly simple for younger people to get sort of started, which is great. What is different eventually is that there's this huge amount of money available that allows organizations to be more effective in political influence. This is not a bad thing per se. I think the key part here is just it has to be acknowledged. And here I think we have seen, in particular in the AI Act, over eventually the last quarter, I would actually just say quarter of the political influence over the AI Act, that there has been a huge shift in who has actually influence over the AI Act. And you can notably see this in specific provisions that make some, well, they're still creating some problems now in interpretation and how to think about this. I think there is, however, a clear connection between the accelerationists in this space that have used a AGI terminology to advance commercial goals. So when it comes to corporations, there's always an alignment that fits with what a corporation should be doing is increasing shareholder value. And so I think that we should always, when organizations interact with policymaking, to understand really well where their ideology is coming from. My last point on this, because there's so much detail to sort of think through, but most of these ideologies that had some influence over the AI Act, and actually also a little bit now about the discourse in Europe around AI policies, are coming from the US and are not systematically consistent with how the European framework with the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the Human Rights Convention actually functions. So there's a bit of a more constrained thinking in Europe around these issues. And sometimes I wish, and I say this now a little bit provocatively, that we could be getting a little bit more out of our own constraints within policy thinking. I'm not saying that I agree with any of this. I try to be agnostic. And I would also, AGI, I just always say I'm agnostic, whether it's religions or beliefs. Because as James Bridle said, what do we know? I mean, we know so little, so agnostic works with me.
And yeah, and your provocation, I think, is very interesting, because when we were preparing this panel, Bart said, but Europe should not just be regulatory power, should also push for competitiveness here, but also to build open source infrastructures, to have a better, well, tech sovereignty, I would also add. And so I wanted to add, because you have led also projects about this. And Mireille cited the Draghi report as a controversial element. And Draghi was citing this, and now we are a bit divided into, should we deregulate? Should we regulate better? So, your view, Bart.
Yeah, thanks. Let me begin, because it's Mireille's night here, to tell a little bit about the time when she was a professor at Nijmegen at my university. We hired her as a as a lawyer in the computer science department, because we wanted to have a course for computer science students who in practice often came across the law, especially data protection law. So Mireille was invited to Nijmegen to join us as a professor, and she started teaching a bachelor course in law, a small course, it's 3 EC, but it was a challenge to transcend these disciplinary boundaries. But she was so successful in this that by now this law course is compulsory in the computer science bachelor in Nijmegen. And I think we're one of the few computer science educations that have this compulsory element in law, and that is certainly her legacy. And I'm very, very proud of this and impressed by this. So I'm in a position to emphasize this. I'd like to do so. Now, to come to your question, indeed, Draghi was mentioned. I feel rather uncomfortable about this Draghi report because he's, I don't want to express this purely in capitalist terminology, but he wants to push Europe into a Silicon Valley dimension. We should copy Silicon Valley and play on the same board. I think in Europe we should play a different board. And we're not going to win if we want to play the game on Silicon Valley terms. They have different infrastructure, different history, a different way of handling investment, venture capital in that world. We're never going to win this if we're going to do it that way. Maybe we should play a different world. And I think open source, investing in open source software, is a very, very viable option. And I really don't understand why Europe doesn't do this more systematically. Really, for all, to start with all software that is used in the public sector, simply demand that is developed open source. It saves costs. A closed source is good for the seller of the software. Open source is good for the buyer. And that's very good to keep in mind here. And I don't understand why this buyer, which is in the end us as a public sector, is not more assertive in this. And demanding that at least public services, but maybe more software, is open source, keeps also the big tech at some distance at least. And it solves also many problems around transparency. So I would certainly want to go in that direction. I'm very happy, I mean, with the Trump effect, which is now happening in Europe. So digital sovereignty is really, really big on the agenda. I would say there are three big worries. One is that Trump hits the kill switch. Or what is happening in some sectors already, like the International Court of Justice in The Hague, that cannot operate anymore because it cannot use Microsoft software anymore. And so this has a huge effect here that we have to be careful with. Then Putin may start pulling transatlantic cables. Then it's also game over here in Europe. And I'm absolutely sure that if the conflict with Russia escalates a bit more, this is the first thing that will happen, that these cables will be pulled. Are we prepared for this? No, no, not in any way. The third threat I see is the US-EU privacy shield, which was working, which was patched the last time because Biden set up this special office, which Trump immediately abolished. I don't know the details of the case, but I understand that Trump is already fighting this. It's only a matter of time before this falls over. So we need in Europe to have emergency plans in this. So a combination of emergency plans and long-term planning. I put a point on the horizon saying we want to be able to operate separately from big tech within 3 years and work towards this. And this is really a big challenge, and we may be forced to this. I think we should combine these strategies in a clever way, the emergency planning and the independence that we should need. Of course, there will be a counter reaction from big tech. We'll see what happens. I think in the end, the only possible solution, and you see already bits of this happening, is that companies like Microsoft really split it up into a European part and an American part, which are really legally separated. Otherwise, they can't operate anymore in Europe. Maybe I'm expanding a bit too much, but
it's super interesting, actually, because we see that we thought it was just a political dependence with US, but actually what you're saying is physical dependence, yeah?
It's digital.
And structural dependency. Yeah. Mireille, you want to comment?
It was a 6 ECTS master course, Bart.
That's how we started, but in the end, yeah. But that didn't
and then we added, yeah. So I had planned actually to devote part of the keynote to the dilemma of neoliberalism, not as a word to throw at anybody who is trying to make money by operating on a market, but neoliberalism in the sense of looking at the history of the Mont Pelerin Society, which was a group of academics, economists who had a very particular idea about how the economy should work, and who actually sat down together and said, how do we get impact on the government? How do we get our idea of how the economy should be run? How can we make that into a reality? And you know what they did? They said, let's go to the law schools and let's teach the lawyers how this works. Have you heard of transaction costs? Everybody is now talking about transaction costs. So the teachings of the Mont Pelerin Society, yeah, they were sort of formalized. There was no empirical evidence whatsoever for their teachings, but they managed to spread it on the law faculties, and even in the Netherlands, every lawyer gets a course in rational choice theory, and now, of course, also in behavioral economics. Now, this has taken over our idea of how an economy runs. You should only do something not with the market if there is market failure, which is defined in a very particular way. Okay, so I wanted to talk about that and then to conclude that it seems that the only way that we can be saved in Europe from authoritarianism is by neoliberals. Look at Germany, look at France. So I also wanted to talk about authoritarianism and the alignment of those who are doing this race for AGI, their alignment with authoritarianism in the state. That's obvious. If you want to create a new species that is better than everybody else, and you don't care that this is not testable, let alone contestable, and you don't care, then you are already authoritarian, you already know better. So I think this is a very important, it is actually a response also to what Cornelia said. Why I think open source AI, because I'm talking about AI, why open source AI is very important is because that's the only way to make AI seriously testable and contestable. So there are 4 freedoms that the open source initiative takes over from the free software movement, which they directly advocate for open source AI. And one of the important freedoms is to study a system and to modify a system and to share it, etc. But to study a system, you really need, in this case, to have access to the data, for instance. And there are many corporations like, what's it called? Meta, yeah. So they have, yeah, you know, Facebook, Meta, Alphabet, Google, trying to confuse us. Meta. So Meta has its own AI, and they say it's open source. But we don't know on what data it was trained. They might give us some data, but we cannot check. So I think it's extremely important that AI, whether it's AGI or whatever, that it is made testable and contestable. And this is about falsification, not only about verification. And we still have to invent, both in computer science terms and in terms of empirical real-world testing, what contestable, falsifiable AI is. And for that, of course, we need open source AI, because otherwise you can't test. So if somebody says, we need these systems and I'm going to be agnostic about them, I would say if somebody tries to sell you something that has not been tested and that can by definition not be tested, I'm not going to be agnostic. I'm going to say this is by default a system I don't want to buy. I don't want to have on our internal market. So in that sense, I would not be agnostic.
Can I respond?
Yeah, I want that all the three of you respond, and then go on.
Yeah, so I agree with this testability. What amazes me often is that there is so little talk about who is responsible about AI. That question is not so much asked. I mean, anecdote, maybe you've heard about this. Air Canada had a chatbot on its webpage. At some stage, it sent a customer the other way, and the customer sued Air Canada. And then in court, Air Canada said, well, this chatbot is a separate legal entity, and we're not responsible, etc. And the judge said, nonsense, you're responsible, you pay the fine. Now, in reaction to this, I wrote a short blog, humanly written. But I suggested the following: to make it compulsory to every organization that puts a chatbot on its webpage, to put underneath the chatbot a button. At the end of the conversation, you can press the button. You get a log, a transcript of the conversation that happened, provided with the digital signature of the organization with which you had the conversation. This doesn't change the legal situation in any way. The organization is responsible, but it gives the user something in the hands that you can say, well, this organization told me this. I have a digital signature on it. I can go to court for this. This is such a simple measure. But if I tell this to people in general, they say, oh, this will never happen. The industry will never accept this, or this will kill the industry. Or so. Well, kill it. I mean, this is protection. This is the kind of thing we should try to organize. And if you impose such obligations, I would think this has a very beneficial influence on the field, because it will force these companies to make sure that they technically make sure that the chatbot responds in alignment with the policy that it has itself, and that it should accept the remaining risks that are there. So there are some measures in the legal area that we can enforce already here. And I really don't understand why this isn't happening. Some things can be so simple. Also, when hospitals use AI for making the medical decision, I always ask who's responsible. And then I hardly get a clear answer. Let's organize this more clearly. And this is also a way of constraining what's happening here.
But that's why we are here, to think out of the box, the privilege of being basically all scholars at the table. Alan, I think you have a lot to say on open source, but on many other.
Now I want to open up two threads, and the one thread is this issue of open source, because there are some folks who work in the Digital Life Initiative at Cornell Tech, which is, we study ethics, politics, quality of life in digital societies, and looking at this question of what it means to even say open source AI. And because at least one of our students has studied open source prior to the current areas of AI, and it's meaningful then for people to see the code in prior times, as we all know. But now, when you reveal the code, it's not really a meaningful indicator of how the algorithm and the models are going to perform. And then you get the conundrum of, well, no one's going to show you the data because they're going to say things like, oh, privacy, this is a problem, we can't show you the data. So I'm not, it's not to say, no, this cannot happen, or no, we shouldn't try for it. It's more to say, what was the purpose of open source and open code, and what's the equivalent in the space of AI and now generative AI that we can achieve? What would be the standards? And I think that what you're talking about, both of you, in the concept of accountability may be one of those metrics where we say, well, that. Okay, so that's on the open source. I'm sure we can pick it up. But I wanted, and also Mireille, if we have time, I want you to elaborate on this declaration that it cannot be tested. For one, I want to ask, like, for what? You know, when we talk about safety, but there are other considerations, and I think when you were talking about Kapoor and Narayanan, you indicated those things. But anyway, that's a question of you very, dogmatic about cannot be tested, and I think there's something very subtle there that I'm hoping you'll bring out. But the other thing is more related to privacy, which is, I love this idea of behavioral data freezing the future. Like that's, I don't know, I wish I had thought about that, because there's a lot of concern about the fact that these algorithms are learning from the past, and whatever they're putting together are functions of the past. So I want to link this to your Merton quote, because many of us who are concerned about anonymization, what we want to say is that anonymization is not very important. What's more important is that the machine, based on your past behaviors, has identified you as this type of person. And I know you've written about profiling, machine algorithmic-based profiling. Based on this behavioral data, we assign you to certain profiles or to certain interests. And it's the machine creating this knowledge. And even if it's false, you've lost the freedom to some degree to be anything else. And so I just thought that that was such a good example of, because the machine is saying something about you, profiling you, pegging you in a certain way, the real consequence for you is how the machine then reacts to you, and by consequence, the very people who are relying on the machine. And of course, it's black boxed and so on. So I was excited by that part of your talk.
I would stay an hour to keep on with this discussion, but the time is running fast. We have cocktails soon, and we have a surprise coming that we cannot still say. But I would like to ask to Cornelia, maybe looking also at the future, because we close for the opening. So what do we expect, or what do you expect?
Oh, wow, this is a very open question. Let me maybe just say what's happening currently, and a topic that hasn't mentioned that I think is extremely important to dive into. So in the context, for those that are not following in detail, the AI Act implementation, there is of course the GPI Code of Practice that is currently negotiated with the model providers, and the Commission has opened a consultation on their draft guidance to define better or help providers understanding where they fall in the context of the GPI model. And here again, I think it's really important to understand where these measurements that they have introduced in the legislation actually come from. I don't have the time to sort of elaborate on that, but I think it is important a couple of points. I think we use terminology that assumes that this is all only understandable by computer scientists, but AI is profoundly socio-technical, and much of what happens in the context of the benchmarks and the evaluations is much more a question of how many millions of prompts a company acquires in order to test a certain model, or in the context even more important, in the context of the safety measurements, so understanding whether a model is actually safe enough to not be jailbreaked or to not be turned into a hate model is also, again, something that is profoundly done by humans that actually develop these prompts, except now they start, of course, to be developed also by models, but so there is intrinsically much more social aspects in there. To me, as we move forward, and that goes a little bit to the technology, to AI actually just being another technology in the context of internet, cloud, software, AI, is that we are actually talking about content moderation in the broader context of models, and I think that would be really important to people to understand that all we do, and this is highly political, that depends where the model's coming from, how have they been trained, not only what data they have been trained on, but how they have been fine-tuned by the model provider, and what that means for our understanding of our society.
Thank you so much. So again, we have to go towards a conclusion, but there's a big surprise for Mireille. I hope she doesn't expect anything. There was no whistleblower. So I asked Serge Goedwirt to come with the surprise on the stage, and he can also explain.
I don't know if I am surprised, but I will try. I would say February 1994. That's 31 years ago. And that was actually the moment I started as a part-time postdoc researcher at the Faculty of Law of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, where Professor René Fouquet wanted me to stimulate conceptual legal research in the department dealing with legal theory, legal history, and other meta-juridical disciplines. I remember a very large and heterogeneous group of researchers, stretching from people that did Neerlandistiek, people that did legal logics, argumentation, specialists of Hobbes and Thomas Aquinas, and that to tax lawyers and people from the law and economics even. Well, but the challenge I had to solve was to have this multiplicity work together around the same issues, of which the first one was a reflection around the fundamental legal concepts of environmental law. Well, I can tell you not everybody was very enthusiastic. And people had really to be convinced and pulled over their reticence. Not so with one of these persons. Not so with the then still doctoranda, Mireille Hildebrandt. When I entered her room, she was curious, she was prepared, she was sharp, and she had already started the conceptual work. She was already triggering. And we probably started to think together and disagree from then on. Very interestingly, she then already pointed at the need to investigate and understand how environmental engineers cope with environmental issues. Understanding the practices of others, that was it then already. Since then, our research and professional itineraries have remained closely intertwined. And thanks to non-stop and sometimes difficult and hard conceptual discussions, we've built up a long-standing scientific relationship based on mutual respect and trust, spanning quite some different fields of interest. I had the honor to be a member of Mireille's PhD jury on punishment and due process, again something different, in 2002, and I wrote the following comment. Rigorous mastery of positive law, interdisciplinary theoretical reflection and weighted commitment are the ingredients of high-quality legal scholarship. You, Mireille Hildebrandt, have excellently connected those elements into a delightful dissertation that deserves the highest number of stars in the Michelin Guide of Legal Scholarship, including the mention Vaut le Voyage. 23 years later, nothing's really changed. Mireille still improved, remaining fidèle à soi-même. One of the best things I did in my career is probably that I convinced her to come and work at the VUB in the just born LSTS research group in the framework of a very big research project involving Bruno Latour and Isabelle Stenger, Jean-Paul van Bendigem and Koen Raas, a project that I had obtained on the relationship between law and science, and that particularly engaged with the conceptual figure of what we then called the correlated human. In the slipstream of this and other research projects with Paul de Hert in the cockpit, we launched the CPDP conferences, not in 2009, but in 2007, involving quite some older people present here. That was in De Buren. And after that, we went to the CAI, and your first slow thinking seminar was in Les Halles in 2009, I think. But we can discuss about that with the class later on. Mireille would further stay in Brussels without stopping to grow as a thinker and a scientist, as we have just been able to see and experience again. The winning of a prestigious ERC was more than deserved a recognition. Mireille's writings will remain a source of inspiration. One of Mireille's main points, and today we haven't talked a lot about that, but it was there still, a point that has been interwoven in her work from the beginning on is the need to keep the rule of law as a main compass and as a constitutional principle. Today, unfortunately and frighteningly, the importance of that message can't be underestimated, since particratic representative democracy has now shown to be the rule of law's worst and most destructive enemy, jeopardizing fundamental rights, legality of government, and checks and balances. Anyway, there should be something coming.
It's coming.
Anyway.
Here is the surprise.
Beyond warm personal friendships and complicities, we couldn't let Mireille go into retirement without an expression of respect and gratitude. That is why Emilie van den Hoven, Katja, and Gianmarco and I have undertaken to gather contributions from colleagues and friends to make a Liber Amicorum. But as you can see, ceci n'est pas encore un livre. The title will be Law Does Not Compute, Conversations with Professor Mireille Hildebrandt. The list of contributors is impressive, with chapters written by, and I'm going to name everybody, Anthony Duff, Jeanne Gakier, Laura Dreschler, Gloria González-Fuster, Michael Veal, Jean-Paul van Bendigem, Sylvie Delacroix, Gian Claudio Malgieri, Diana Moccano, Paul de Hert, Jorrit Smit, Geneviève van der Stichelen, Simone Carisaghi, Niels van Dijk, Tatiana Duarte, Elena Esposito, Jaap Henk Hoepman, Lorenzo Magnani, Kieron O'Hara, Bart Jacobs, Frederik Zuiderveen, Borgesius, Sarah Lowski, Denise Merigou, Ryan Huttner, Roger Brownsworth, Julie Cohn, Fleur Jones, Esther Keimolen, Frank Pasquale, Burkhard Schaffer, and the 4 editors. But you know, Mireille, how things go in academy. This is not yet a book, since publishing procedures take time. We are, however, very, very far, and the publisher will most probably be the Edinburgh University Press. Ceci n'est pas encore un livre, mais le geste y est déjà. Le livre va suivre. And so,
Do you want to comment, or we go to drinks?
yes, I think it's time for drinks.
We have 140
emotions,
people, and regardless of the strikes, and we were all listening to this amazing thing. So thank you so much, and now we can go to the drinks. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know what to say, but this is totally surprising and very impressive. Thank you really very, very much. All the people that are here and the people that are not here. Thank you.
Thank you.